Okay, we're going to continue looking at reproduction, different modes, and how that can, in this case, lead to trade-offs between the size and the number of offspring. The larger the investment in each individual offspring, the fewer offspring you can have. And so again, thinking about a fixed amount of energy, or is it better to produce 1,000 individuals with very little nutrition via egg yolk in each of those, or have 10 that have a lot of investment per individual? It obviously depends on the context of the environment and likelihood to survive, etc. So investment in energy and resources and time, and loss of chances for other activities such as foraging. So really, closed system of how much energy is possible for an organism to capture and utilize, and what do they do with that time and energy. This is kind of an interesting theory, I guess, the Lack clutch size, the maximum number of offspring a parent can successfully raise to maturity. David Lack noticed that birds' clutch size increases with latitude, where longer daylight hours allow parents more time to forage and feed more offspring. So if you're, particularly for birds, there's a stage where the parents are going out collecting food and bringing it back to their offspring. And higher latitudes, you think about Alaska during the summer, it can be light for nearly 24 hours a day. And so parents can forage all day long, where at lower latitudes, you can have 10 hours of darkness. And so parents are not able to forage and bring nutrition back to their offspring. And so this gives some adaptive advantage for individuals at higher latitudes. You can also think about this with migration, how animals migrate as well, particularly birds. And so this is looking at percentage of eggs surviving to fledgling or flying away, and the number of eggs laid. With smaller numbers of eggs laid, 5 and less, you have a near 100% survivorship to fledgling. And then as you get more eggs, that tends to decline. There's some variation in here. This is for black-backed gulls. And so, you might get lucky and have 12 and they all survive. Or you also have to think about what's the overall fitness of those individuals, meaning are these 3 or 2 individuals larger than if you've got 12? Are they all kind of puny, but they do survive to fledgling, but maybe they don't have, maybe they die shortly thereafter due to a variety of reasons. But in general, there's a downward trend, obviously some variability within that. And then this is looking at this trade-off that plants do between number of seeds and the size of the seeds. So if you have a very, very small seed, likely per plant you can do up to 1 million seeds. Where you have a very large seed, it's going to be quite small. Try and think of like a coconut versus I'm not sure if there's a certain type of plants. Coconut versus like a raspberry that has lots of seeds, or something like that. So there's this overall trade-off between number and mass. So you can produce fewer large ones or lots of little ones. A lot of it depends on the environment which the seeds are going to land, and your dispersal strategy as well. This is a trade-off for the fence lizard. So this is kind of an interesting one, looking at the so this is clutch size, the number of eggs, and then the kind of a histogram of the number of females which have that clutch size, and then the mean size of the egg. So as we move from California, Oregon to Washington, in California, fence lizards tend to have fewer eggs, but the mean egg size is larger. In Washington, their individuals tend to have more eggs, so average clutch size, median clutch size being 12, where in California the median being 7. But on average, these Washington eggs are much smaller, 0.4 grams versus almost 0.7 grams. And so one thought here is that the northern populations have a larger clutch size but smaller eggs compared to southern populations. Small eggs develop faster and produce smaller hatchlings, which grow faster but can't run to escape predators. So in an area where you have maybe a short growing season, it's important for those eggs to hurry up and hatch, go out and start feeding so they can gain biomass before the winter. But perhaps in more lower latitudes or warmer areas where the growing season's prolonged, perhaps it's better to have fewer offspring, have them emerge larger, where they can escape predators and they don't have to worry about bulking up as much before winter. And so this is an example of some plasticity within the species depending on where they live, and some mechanisms behind that observation. Allocating resources to reproduction can decrease the individual's growth rate, survival rate, and potential for future reproduction. Rickliffs observed a trade-off between annual fecundity and annual survivorship. So fecundity, number of eggs; survivorship, obvious living. Where for an individual bird, the number of eggs they lay has an impact on their overall survivorship. And so that's an issue. Part of that can be thought of maybe as age as well. Age is a confounding factor, where older individuals are less likely to survive, and they might also have a higher fecundity because they're larger. But also, if you have a whole bunch of offspring, particularly for birds, that you need to keep coming back and forth and feeding, you are now feeding more, you're expending more energy to get those resources, you're trying to keep them alive, which increased feeding trips going from the nest out to the feeding grounds increases the chances of predation, as well as you're expending more energy. You have less energy to defend from sickness, illness, other natural forms of mortality, and maybe less energy going into winter. So all those are compounding factors where you're putting more energy into your offspring, therefore allocating less energy towards yourself, which could lead to overall reduced individual survivorship, but it might impart increased fitness, right? So you might have more offspring that go on and survive longer. So it's a trade-off between what's good for you versus what's good for your evolutionary fitness. This is kind of a weird one, but this is looking at fruit flies, where they have put a bunch of males with mated females in, and a bunch of males with unmated or virgin females in effectively jars, and to see what would happen. And they found that males with virgin females would allocate more energy into reproduction, and therefore have a shorter lifespan compared to males that didn't have to bother with reproduction, and they then didn't have to expend energy for reproduction and survived longer. This is a pretty cool trade-off looking at, this is Doug fir, which is not a true fir, but anyway, this is looking at Doug fir, and looking at the annual growth increments within the tree, and comparing that to the number of cones per tree. And the conclusion they're drawing here is that if you have more cones per tree, you typically have a lower annual growth ring index compared to having fewer cones per tree. You typically have increased growth index. So part of this is due to age. I assume these data were normalized, meaning that generally the growth increment you put down when you're 100 years old in a tree is smaller than that when you put down when you're 10 or 15. But it's showing this relationship between energy allocation to individual growth versus energy allocation to producing, in this case, cones, which is very energetically expensive. And so typically as the trees get larger, they're able to devote a larger portion of their energy into reproduction because they've already made it over. There's usually some size threshold for where you're really either vulnerable to predation, or in the case of trees, browsing or drought. You get to a certain size, you're big enough, you can kind of weather annual climate variation. You're not going to get, totally browsed down by a deer, and you can start to shift your allocation to reproduction. So by allocating resources to reproduction instead of growth, an individual will reproduce at a smaller size. Small individuals often produce fewer offspring than large individuals, suggesting allocating resources to current reproduction might decrease the individual's potential for future reproduction. Okay. So different morphologies and behaviors are adaptive to different life cycle stages. Early life stages are vulnerable to predation and competition for food, but small size allows early stages to do things that adults can't. And organisms have various mechanisms to protect small life stages, i.e. parental investment. Provisioning eggs and embryos, yolk, protective covering for eggs, nutrient-rich endosperms in plants. So these are all formed, my fisheries professor always called the yolk sac in newly hatched salmon as sack lunch from mom. There's also a disadvantage to that as well. If you're a fat, juicy egg with a big embryo, a big yolk, you're also very delicious. You're high in fat, and so you're going to be predated on more. So there's other strategies like salmon bury the eggs in a red. So it's both a benefit and a cost, right? If you hatch, great, but your siblings may be eaten. And then parental care is an investment in time and energy to feed and protect offspring. So you think of parental care, like here parental care is like really the protection and feeding post-hatching. And then parental investment, maybe the larger term, which includes the size, positioning, protection of eggs. This is a pretty extreme example of a kiwi egg that's, I forget the number. It's like 30% of the biomass of the entire organism. It's a little bird with a big egg. That's pretty crazy. And then here's a male horned land frog that carries its young on its back from tadpole stage to small offspring. So it's a form of parental investment of, presumably that costs energy to carry around your young, makes you more susceptible to predation, things like that. But those young will have a higher likelihood of survivorship. Dispersal is the movement of organisms or propagules from their birthplace. Small offspring are typically well suited for dispersal, and dispersal can reduce competition among close relatives and allow colonization of new areas, escape areas from diseases or high predation. So, you ideally, it's a gamble of like sending juveniles, offspring out further because many of them might not survive, whereas if you are surviving there as an adult, it's probably a good spot. And there's some kind of variation in that. Things like Olympia oysters, and many of the bivalves actually, but Olympia oysters in particular, larvae settle based on chemical cues, and those chemical cues are honed into the smell, the chemicals produced by adults. And so they can actually go along, and they call it tasting or sampling. They kind of bounce along the sediment. And when they detect adults of their species, they'll settle out there. So which does result in a fair amount of self-recruitment, meaning if you have a population of oysters, in, for example, Fidalgo Bay near Anacortes, where they did a big Olympia oyster restoration, they put out some individuals, and then the hope is that that population self-recruits, builds out beyond the individuals you place there, and then ideally seeds additional areas around that bay. The seeding additional areas part hasn't really worked, but the population has self-recruited and grown much larger because those larvae have mechanisms to disperse, but also are attracted to the chemical cues of members of their species. And so they might not land right where mom is from, but they'll land somewhere adjacent near other members of that species. And the idea is that if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me, right? Like if there are members of my species that are here, it's probably not the worst place in the world to be. So this is an example of, this is a snail example looking through geological time of two different snails that had planktonic and non-planktonic distributions. And so what this is looking at is the geographical area. They should really put a y-axis on this. The geographical area that these snails inhabited, and showing a decline in non-planktonic snails through time in comparison to the planktonic snails. This is pretty common in snails, and we have some invasive snails, there's a Japanese oyster drill, and they hatch by crawl-away young. And so when they were introduced with shellfish as part of the early aquaculture in the late 1800s, early 1900s, these hitchhiked and rode over here, and they've been kind of slow to disperse because they have a non-planktonic stage. They have crawl-away young. The females lay eggs, and out of that egg comes a tiny snail, compared to planktonic invaders, which tend to disperse more quickly because they have a planktonic stage where the larvae are floating around the ocean and kind of go wherever the currents take them. So you can also look at the same thing as from an invasive species standpoint, that non-planktonic young disperse more slowly compared to planktonic young, which I think is another way of looking at it, which is pretty interesting as well. And so some species have a state of dormancy, a suspended growth and development, in which the organism can survive unfavorable conditions. Small seeds, spores, eggs, embryos are best suited for dormancy. Less metabolic energy is needed to stay alive, but some larger animals also enter dormancy. One example of this in the this is the next one. Or cysts in particular. There's phytoplankton Alexandrium, which produces paralytic shellfish poisoning. It produces a toxin called saxitoxin. And those cysts can lay dormant in the sediment for on the order of hundreds of years. And so they lay dormant in the sediment, and then if a big storm comes by and agitates them and brings them to the surface, then they'll hatch. And they've actually been able to do that in the lab by coring sediment and pulling these cysts out of dated sediments that we know are 100, 200 years old. And then in the lab, they can actually hatch these. And so it's an interesting way of ensuring that, there's some of your offspring are there for a long time. You can also think about it from a genetic standpoint too. If you've got mixing across generations, that could help keep genetic diversity in the population. So you could imagine a system where something comes through, knocks out a certain genetic quotient of your population, but then 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years later, individuals hatch that were the cysts were formed prior to that event, and so then that's a way of retaining those genetics through bottlenecks. And functional specialization of stages is common in complex life cycles. In many insects, the larval stages are specialized for feeding and growth, and the adults specialized for dispersal and reproduction. Again, think about aquatic insects. Most of what we think of aquatic insects are larval stages, where they crawl around in the gravel, sand, etc., feed, and then they metamorphose into the winged life stage, where they may or may not even feed. It could just be the clock is ticking, find a mate, lay some eggs, and try to get them in the best spot possible. So it allows this to where maybe the freshwater stage is maybe more stable, maybe it's less predators, and then all of the larval stages metamorphose into the wing stages around the same time. So then, if you can imagine being in a stream, it might be hard to find a partner, even if they're 10 meters away in a fast-moving stream. That's hard to find your partner. Well, if we all turn to a stage where we have wings, then we can all get together and make some babies. Marine inverts larvae are specialized for both feeding and dispersal in ocean currents. Many larvae have specialized ciliated bands for feeding, covering most of the body, and they have spines or bristles to deter predators. This goes back to the zoea, the larval stage of a crab. They have a number of different stages, but they have these giant spines to make it difficult for fish to eat. And as we know more and more about marine larvae, they tend to have a fair amount more behavior than we think. And so they can adjust their position in the ocean depending on currents, because you can imagine if you're a clam and your larvae just flow out in the ocean and they all blow out to the middle of the ocean and you're an intertidal clam, well, they're now hosed, right? They need to live in the intertidal. So how do organisms that have a planktonic larval stage on the order of weeks or a month be able to find the beach again? And they can do that by riding the currents. As the tide goes out, you go down to the bottom and kind of hide in the gravel. As the tide comes in, you come up to the surface and you're blown back in. And so instead of just washing in and out passively, they can actually do floating or sinking behavior based on both their ability to swim or the way that they shape their body, pulling in appendages so they sink more rapidly. So it's kind of a growing field of planktonic ecology and how do these critters move around. Okay, this will be the end of part 2, and it looks like I'll do a third part, and that should wrap up chapter 7.